Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for joining the third episode of the Dialogues podcast of the Global History Lab, based at the Center for Research in the Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities at the University of Cambridge. We started this series in 2025, and our aim is to bring our students and teaching fellows together to talk about the different tracks that we are studying in the first part of the Global History Lab program, which is History of the Word, which runs from the late Middle Ages until the 21st century. And we discuss global issues and the interconnectedness of our word throughout this period. We have a really exciting lineup of roundtable speakers today from Panteion University, Athens, Greece, and the University of Ibadan in Nigeria. I just would like to start with a few housekeeping rules. I'm going to have, as I mentioned before, a roundtable discussion first with the invited speakers, and then we will open up the floor to questions and comments from our audience, and then we will conclude our conversation. Please, if you have any questions in the Q&A part, raise your hand or put your question in the chat box. And now I would like to introduce our distinguished guest speakers. We have Apeike Umolu, who is a historian of political thought of the 19th century. Her research focuses on exploring theories of nation, state, and citizenship in the Pan-African world. Her PhD thesis is provisionally titled An Intellectual History of Patriotism in the 19th Century Pan-African World. Apeike is a teaching fellow at Ibadan. And she's joined by two of her students, Edwin Joseph Ogbonna, who's a researcher and final year student of history at the University of Ibadan, Nigeria, specializing in African history, political philosophy, and the evolving digital economy. And Abiodun Adewumi Gold, who's a second year master's student in history at the University of Ibadan. His scholarly interests are situated within African and global history, with a focus on colonialism, governance, political economy, labor regimes, land tenure systems, and social transformation in the global south. He has written and engaged in diverse research works that interrogate colonial and post-colonial reforms, indigenous institutions, state power, and socio-economic change within comparative and transnational frameworks. His research adopts a historically grounded and interdisciplinary approach, contributing to wider global debates on empire, development, and historical continuity and change. Our other teaching fellow today is Dr. Constantine Theodoridis, who is a historian of the early modern period. He specializes in European Ottoman relations, the uses of ceremonial in diplomacy, and the history of the Dutch Republic. He's joined by his student, Michael Dragopoulos, a fourth-year BA student at Panteion University with interests in the history of diplomacy and military history. His BA thesis is a study of provisioning strategies developed by the Greek army in its early 20th century campaigns. Now, I would like to first, with my warm-up question, which is what it's like to study and teach in the Global History Lab. What can you tell us about your experience so far?
Would you like me to kick off?
Yes, please.
Okay, great. Well, it's been a wonderful experience. I hope my students would agree that we've had a good time in our sessions. So our sessions have evolved, I think, through the first term, responding really to the differences in how you can teach using digital technologies compared to doing face-to-face. So we initially started with 3 sessions, I think, but it was probably a bit onerous because we had connection issues. And then we reduced that down to 2 sessions, combined sessions. And I think they worked better to have less sessions and more people on each of the sessions. In terms of the conversations that we've had, the wonderful thing about working with students who have an open mind because they've self-selected to actually join a course on global history is that they often come with a diverse range of interests about the world, but also a deep amount of interest about their own location as well, which is Africa and Nigeria. And that's been very interesting for me as an educator who often works mostly looking at the United States and Europe. So it's been, I think, a great experience, both pedagogically in thinking about how do we actually facilitate conversations, historical conversations on a global scale, but also in terms of the curriculum as well, in having a group of students who are genuinely interested in global conversations, but also situated outside of the West, so have so much more knowledge and understanding of how things happen in the global South.
Thank you, Apeike. Constantine, maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's been really, really wonderful, and really the platform that we've been using has made everything so easy because we had a ready-made syllabus. Everything was scheduled in a really unique way. And the thing with our group is that we were doing everything in person. My students were Greek. I'm Greek. I'm a product of the Greek education system. So we basically worked on translating. Quote unquote, because our sessions were, of course, in English, but we had to kind of translate the mentality and the structure behind the readings in the course itself. So it was really interesting seeing how we can do that based on our interests. And I was already aware that my students have a very specific range of interests that has to do mostly with the 19th and the 20th century, because most of my students were actually coming from a BA in politics. So really, the one theme that I realized that we were discussing over and over again was whether it's actually possible to do global history without having the West as its center. And by that, I mean, especially the period between the 16th and the 18th century, when most of our readings basically revolve around how local societies respond to European expansion. Things become easier in the 19th and 20th century. But yeah, one of the main things that kept coming up again and again was how could we possibly do a global history that does not involve, say, the British Empire? Could we do a history of the 18th century that is just, Latin America and India? And we never really got around to addressing that. So maybe that's something to bring up again. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Constantine. Now I would like to turn to our students. If you'd like to share just some general pieces of experience about your time in the Global History Lab.
All right, thank you very much. It was actually an experience. The process was quite challenging for a start for we African students, especially from the University of Ibadan. We had few constraints due to economic situation of the country, power supply and all of that. But even amidst of that challenges, we were able to scale through and with the help of our tutor. And even that, the global history was a section that spanned through and go into details of interconnectedness of the world, and that's quite a thing. We were able to dive into various sections of it, how the world come together, and not just by migration only, but via economy and international, connectedness. So it was quite an experience that is worth venturing into. And we hope that subsequent ones will even be much better by also incorporating more confidence structures. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Michael, maybe?
Yeah. I like the course a lot because it gave a lot of new insights about the interconnectivity of the world, even from the 1300s. And I don't really have many complaints about the course itself because it was exactly what it was supposed to do, which I found very fulfilling. Of course, in a course of a semester, you can't cover everything. It would be interesting to see more about Africa, for example, and maybe a more. We got into a lot of stuff that were going on in China. Maybe we could see India a little bit more. I think it would be interesting, but it gave a new perspective, especially to us Europeans, about what the world was looking like before the colonialism, which is something that, as before the colonialism and the 19th, 20th century era, which, as my professor mentioned, due to our location, it's something and our field of studies is something we're more familiar with. So I found that very, very productive for the course itself and for the interconnectivity of the universities among each other, because there are many universities in this seminar, in this course. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Any other thoughts on experience in GHL?
Yeah, hello.
Yeah, please.
For me, it was more about the shared knowledge, seeing things from a different light of my colleagues, and being able to comprehend more about interpreting the sources and not to like divert from what this sources is actually telling us. Even regardless of our own biases, we tend to view those sources for what they are. So it was really interesting, like to get to understand deeply how the whole globe is interconnected without colonialism, how it was developing at their space. It was really a wonderful experience, regardless of the shortcomings of my own geographical location.
Thank you, Joseph. You mentioned a couple of things that truly resonate with me. One of the things was, yes, we cannot cover everything, and I think this is something we this is an issue we constantly encounter. I taught in GHL for 2 years in Uganda and Italy, and I'm the course coordinator, so I have, I think, a good amount of experience about related to teaching everything and the history of the whole world for several centuries. We cannot cover everything, but that's why we're so interested in the connections between these places, like how certain events that happened around the globe affected other parts of the globe. I think this is a truly compelling and interviewing aspect of doing global history. And it's related to the second point that I really liked, which was how we bring together this time, people from Greece and Nigeria to discuss today's topic, which I'm really excited about, social changes and movements, social changing movements. And that brings me to my first challenge question that I shared with you before our event, which was, how does adopting a long-term historical perspective change the way in which we interpret contemporary social movements, particularly in terms of their goals, strategies, and outcomes? So in other words, do you think understanding contemporary social movements, this task is facilitated by studying the Middle Ages, the early modern period? What's your experience?
Yeah, so if I could go first, I mean,
Please.
I've always wondered how, or rather, I think there's a striking modernity to the word social movements, and I'm saying this from a historiographical perspective in the sense that you don't get to hear people talk about the Protestant Reformation as a social movement very often. It just sounds odd. So my experience is that when people even discuss the term social movements, what they mean is 19th and 20th century movements. And the things that these movements are asking for are usually very geared to a world that's already globalized, and a world that uses modern categories of analysis. So perhaps the rest of the participants in this roundtable agree or disagree. I would really love to hear what you have to say about this.
Thank you so much. I think I really wanted to hear an early modernist perspective on of doing global history and focusing on social change movements. One piece of experience I share with other teaching fellows is that a lot of students really become interested in the material when we get close to our period, or at least the period of that in which their parents and grandparents lived. But I'm very interested in the connection, not just globally, geographically, but also in time. So thank you. Other thoughts on this question?
Well, I don't know if I can say something. It's not a question.
Yeah, please, yeah.
Yes, just as Constantine said, many of these are reformulations of older struggles. If you look at in terms of goals, a long-term historical view, actually, it helps demands that the demands of contemporary social movement are really new. Most of this consciousness are something that has actually been in place for a long time. It's just a new approach into them. That's just what I wanted to add to that.
Thank you.
In terms of thinking about the relationship between, I guess what you're asking is about how much historicism plays a part in how we deal with the world today. And I think that one of the things that I've really gotten from this course, because it pushes us, I think, as tutors as well, out of our comfort zones and the things that we spend our day researching, is that looking at the past can help you better understand how similar events, if we think of human civilization, how similar events that are dislocated by time could have similar antecedents. And therefore, when you're moving, for example, from discussing the Mongol Empire to the Qing dynasty, to the European empires, to the African empires, you seem to have a vocabulary that allows you, or maybe you falsely think you have a vocabulary that allows you to discuss all of these things. And I think that this then reduces the tendency towards exceptionalism, actually. I think it allows us to begin to think that, oh, we're not that special in the world, and no time period is that special. When you have grown up perhaps only learning, I studied the Romans and the Vikings. That's what we did in terms of kind of antiquity when I was growing up. But to then now be teaching about the Mongols and the Chinese at around that same time, you begin to realize that, oh, what you might think is innovative in different civilizations may not be as innovative as we think. And then that gives us a different approach to our contemporary world. Because when we do begin to see phenomena, we then do start to think, oh, what has happened in the past? Has this happened in the past? Have these sorts of things existed? And maybe they haven't existed in this space, but they might have existed somewhere else. But I think that can then give us a false sense of confidence about our ability to predict the future. And that then highlights to us, I think, the fact that much of the historicist approach to the contemporary world is limited by, and I think Michael already kind of noted this, you can't study everything. So even if you are still going to use history to help you to understand the modern world, you're still going to be limited by the history that you've studied. So there'll always be that limitation, and then you might begin to think that everything that's happening now is a function of the 5 or 6 or 7 historical periods that you've managed to study in the past. And I think we do often see that with politicians, with news reporters, when they're talking about things in our modern age, they are quite limited in their vocabulary. It's the Cold War and it's the French Revolution, and it's just a few specific things in the past that they can refer to in order to understand the modern world, which is good to make sure that we don't think it's the first time it's happened to us, but also maybe challenges us to have a broader understanding of world history.
Thank you so much. I completely agree, especially when you said we can't study everything. Even if we tried to study everything, we would be limited by, language problems. You can read about the history of the whole world in English, in my case, Hungarian, or the languages we all read, but our level of our depth, or we could go into the extent to which we can understand certain regions just by studying about them is not the same as it is when we speak that language, which is spoken in an area. So that's I think language is something that I find really interesting. Or even if you speak or read or understand to some extent another language, there's still so many issues you can face, like sources, for example. As historians, we have to work with primary sources. Are there available primary sources? What about accessibility of these primary sources, the readability of these primary sources? So there's so many interesting issues, I think, that we face as aspiring historians in this lab. Thank you so much. I think Michael wanted to say something.
No, you just covered. I want to bring up the sources.
Please.
We study about history. I was just trying to think about an example, and I was thinking based on the social movements about socialism, that if we want to study how a movement will go on throughout time, if you study history based from the Soviet encyclopedia, for example, compared to an American or a British or a French source, the outcome would be different naturally. So I just want to bring that example because I was trying to figure it out.
Thank you so much. Shall we move on to my second challenge question, which was, in what ways can comparing social movements across different global contexts challenge dominant or Western-centric narratives of social change? And I think this question is interesting because our director, Professor Jeremy Edelman, wrote a famous piece on where is global history going and what it's like today to study global history, and let's say the challenges within global history. Being Eurocentric or Western-centric is definitely a piece of criticism that many historians still bring up when it comes to global history. I don't know if in your classes you face this issue of Eurocentrism or Western-centrism, or did you manage to focus on, of course, other parts of the world to fight this dominance? Did you find enough primary sources you could discuss to kind of go against this Western dominated kind of scholarship that still, in my opinion, characterizes history writing? Maybe it was not a problem at all.
Okay, thank you for this again. I would like to say this. Judging from our experiences from the classrooms, we talked about the connection between the Indians with the Mongols and others like that. And so looking at those different empires, the Mongol empires, and how they succeed each other several times, we discover that comparing global movement highlights, it shows that how colonial and imperial histories are often erased in Western-centric explanations, if we are going to approach it from that angle. But many social movements in the global south are responses not just to me, to local governments, but to sometimes long histories of foreign domination. So I think that's one of the major, and even economic exploitation and imposed political systems. For example, labor movements, peasant uprising, and youth protests and all of that. So I feel that such comparison challenge the idea that social change, it follows a single Western path, and Western narratives are often suggest that change moves in a linear way, from protest to reform to democracy or rights. So it's largely on European or American experiences. But when we look at movements in Africa as well, Asia, Latin America, I'm talking of contemporary times now, or the Middle East, we see very different trajectories. So movement focuses less on individual rights and more on collective survival. So such as land dignity and cultural autonomy. So I think all of this, it shows that social change is shaped by local histories. So that's my submission.
Very interesting. Thank you for answering my question. Any other thoughts on this, Apeike?
Yeah, I think that probably similar to Constantine's experience. I'm originally Nigerian, so there was a kind of unity. I mean, I can't say that I as either Abiodun or Edwin, but I was born there and grew up within that culture in the diaspora. And I think one of the things that was quite interesting for me, and I'm sure they will agree as well, is how much, because when you're coming out of a very recent national process, you can definitely say that maybe Nigeria itself is very much still in the process of nation building, how much Nigeria itself was the point of reference in our discussions. So a lot of times you will have, we had discussions that could be about anywhere else in the world, but then the Islamic jihads of the 19th century would be brought up. For example, in northern Nigeria, so Dan Fodio's conquest of northern Nigeria would be brought up to try to understand another process in the world. Or people might think about the decolonial processes of the 1950s and 60s as a way to understand something else in the world. So I did find that amongst the group of Nigerians who had come, who are coming out, or maybe are still in processes of nation building and of trying to determine their place in the world, that very real experience, that living experience, really just one generation out of the decolonial era, was the point of reference for understanding global processes, and often the point of reference for understanding processes dislocated by time, even all the way back to antiquity as well.
Thank you, Apeike. I have a follow-up question, which I'd like to address to you and Constantine. I understand that you are from the countries where you teach students, both of you. Can you just say a few words about this experience? Because you probably taught students from other countries as well, if there's any difference, or if difference is not really important, or relatability, I don't know, anything that you can share about teaching where you're from. Constantine, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, my only other previous experience of teaching was teaching students at Princeton University. And really for me, the bridge between the two experiences was language, because I operate in a different personality when I teach in English. So really, I didn't really experience the difference. And the thing with my group at Panteion was that this was a very self-selected group of students who were very committed to this, and their level of, I don't want to say equality, but they were every bit as good as my students at Princeton. So really, it felt like it being very similar. Yeah.
Well, for me, it's very, very different. I think. I think the main difference is that I think something might be specific as well to the West African consciousness, and particularly to the operation of Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism, though it is a political process, it pervades all aspects of, for example, the education system, national identity and global identity for a lot of modern African states. So being in a really quite a Pan-African space for a couple of weeks in which that language was available to discuss global movements, because there is this kind of ready-made global identity or global frame through which to view the world, which is this Pan-African frame, that definitely, I think, allowed us to have conversations that I don't think we would have been able to have, or I would have been able to have with my students elsewhere. And I've taught in the UK, and I've taught primarily at Cambridge, but also at colleges in London as well. And that vocabulary is just not there. It's, you know, it's the vocabulary of internationalism is British internationalism, right? It's British imperialism, which is still a very national way of looking at the world as everything in reference to yourself. But Pan-Africanism forces you to actually think of yourself as belonging to a global community that is experiencing things all that are the same but are also differentiated as well. So I think being from that space, understanding the culture and understanding that vocabulary, because I work in it as well, was, I think, definitely allowed us to have conversations that I don't think I could have had. It was probably easier, I think, to ask students to decenter themselves in their national experiences, because that's what Pan-Africanism insists that you do anyway. You must see yourself in this more global way within the Pan-African community. So maybe I'm not sure if Abiodun or Edwin have anything to add, and if that was unique to our conversations, or if that's something that you guys actually get to do every day at the University of Ibadan. Is that the pedagogy? Is that the approach to things?
Well, you've actually spoken very well, and I think these are some of the issues we actually encountered during the classes, and I think to me, it's part of ways that let's compare the social movement across different global contexts. In Nigeria, we have several structures and barriers compared to, let's say, an international stage. However, this does not disrupt the capacity of our, should I say, ability to adapt to the global content, the global ideology of what should be done at that particular point. I think she has actually, given most of the point. I think that's actually very correct. Very correct. Thank you, ma'am.
That was your.
Yes, Joseph, do you have anything to add?
For me, she've said it all. It's more like viewing it from an African perspective, which is, although we don't view it solely on African perspective, we tend to try to bring in the Orientalist view on stuff, on how events changes, rather than being solely based on an Eurocentric perspective. So we get to understand how different people, different culture with their ideologies influence their social change in a light different from an Eurocentric view. Although the Pan-Africanism, in quotes, to me, it's not really, for me personally, it's not just all about African unity, because as Africans, I love the African culture. I embrace the diversity of the African culture. The African culture is very diverse, and in the Pan-Africanism, it's like embracing this diversity in our unity. So it makes it more unique, and it tends to bring more light to how we as Africans view stuffs with our diverse culture. So it brings this perspective whereby we get to understand how our multicultural approach influences the way we view things.
Thank you so much, Joseph. It's truly interesting to me to hear. the relationship between teaching fellows and students and how you understand each other and how you work together. I think both Constantine and Apeike can second when I say that we all learn a lot from our students and their insights. That's definitely something I experienced in GHL. Okay, I have another question which is related to transnational movements, transnational connections, or let's just say transnational phenomena such as migration, empire, media, digital networks, which are very topical today. How do these phenomena complicate the idea of social movements as primarily national or local phenomena? I'm not sure if my question makes sense, but basically, how do these connections complicate the idea of social movements that we sometimes in school, many times actually study as a national or local phenomena? I don't know if my question
Yeah, it does.
makes sense.
So for me, the idea of a transnational connection is more of a myth because most time in a global era as we have now, we see certain national or local this thing affecting more on a national scale. Like let's take for example the Greenland issue that is currently ongoing with the USA. It's more of a local, or yeah, I would call it more of a local issue that's become a global outcry on a digital network across social media platforms. And we now see that the NATO are now coming in with their citizens, both home and abroad, across different continents, showing their support from Greenland on a digital scale. And oftentimes too, when we look at when people migrate, people carry their political thoughts with them. So this in turn influences a broader national scale of what is termed as transnational political space, because it's a new ideology, or it's an evolving ideology that is now influencing both the host country and the home country. So in a way, local ideologies in this modern era is more like something that is more national and more global. Like I would bring another example in here. When we look at the EndSARS crisis of Nigeria in 2020, we get to see that it was a local movement in Nigeria, but this brought together the solidarity of members across different countries supporting human rights movements in Nigeria. And even in a contemporary issue where the US is trying to help curb the insecurity regarding the killings of Christians in Nigeria. So we get to see that local ideologies is not really centric to being local as it is being termed, because it's tend to imbibe a more globalized view in a contemporary era.
Thank you very much, Joseph. Michael.
I would say that it depends a lot on what social movement we are trying to study, because the feminist movement was based, for example, on the human rights, that women are equal to men, which is historically it wasn't answered in a simple way, but as a concept it's simple. But if we go to more strategic ideologies and movements, again, nationalism or socialism, this complicates, I believe, things a lot more, because we see how immigration, for example, again, in the feminist movement, I'm going a little bit back and forth, we see how it helped to expand the new ideas, or in other occasions, the American Revolution, how it affected the ideas of democracy throughout Europe, and later to the nations of Latin America and Asia to a large and to a further extent. But other ideologies are not really I'm trying to figure out how to say this in a correct way. Other ideologies will be blocked from going to other places if the state thinks that this ideology is harmful to the state itself. Other ideologies like nationalism might rise as a reaction to oppressing movements or bad policies. We see, for example, how nationalism rises in Europe, which is something clearly dangerous, and the US more recently. So I believe it depends more on the social movement and how this movement actually gets into the people's mind.
Thank you, Michael. I think what you said makes perfect sense to me. I actually have a lot of thoughts now that I'd like to add, but I'm also conscious of time. Does anyone have any reflection on either Joseph's or Michael's points or the question in general?
Idea of so Edwin raised about when people move, they take their ideologies with them. And I think one of the things that the Global History Lab has allowed us to explore is the fact that the identities that we often take today to be national identities have been the result of prior migrations. So looking at how people moved, whether it was ideas moving along the Silk Road as well as trade, for example, looking at how horses even moved across continents when we were going over to Mexico and the Spanish taking over to Mexico. But that's the idea that people do make permanent migrations, and when people make those migrations, they take their ideas and ways of life, even their animals, with them. And so when you're now looking at those societies 1,000 years later, and you're not able to unpack and unpick all of the so-called origins or sources of a people, we start to really question whether or not you can talk of pure nationalities, because migration is so important. And just this idea also of having multiple identities, I think the study of empire really brings that home as well. So one of the case studies we looked at was the battle between Clive of India and local Indian Mughal, or the descendants of Mughal authority, and the idea that one of the Indian princes actually sided with Clive of India and fought with him. So that kind of multiple identity of seeing yourself as being both Indian, but also as well having your own interests and maybe siding with foreigners. And we saw that as well in Mexico, people who were being oppressed by local forces actually allowing or siding with foreign forces to come in and suppress the local belligerent. So that idea of having multiple identities as well, being of the local, but also embracing of the foreign, I think does begin to break down the idea of national identities, or at least the purity of national identities.
Thank you very much, Apeike. I think your point on national identities and multiple identities nicely and naturally brings me to my final question, which is a topic I'm really, really interested in. Regarding historical memory, storytelling, and the selective use of the past. So how we use the past, our history in political discourses and political narratives. This is a topic I've worked a bit on, and I'm really interested in how it is happening around the globe. What do you think? What role do, as I said before, historical memory and the use of the past play in mobilizing social movements across different societies across the globe? So what kind of connections do you see between collective memory and the use of it in social movements. Michael?
Yeah, I think that historical memories are crucial on how social movements are formed because basically history is what teaches us. More accurately, I would say it's what it gives us an idea of how movement will affect the people. For example, if we look at fascism and how it risen up in power it has risen up in power in Italy and then Germany with Nazism, we see how it affected the world globally in a bad way. And so we are, after 1945, we try to push more democratic and more global measures to prevent that from happening again. The UN, for example. We see now in Iran what's going on with the protests and how the historical memory plays a role on promoting democratic and basic human rights. Basically, it's not about democracy at this point, it's basically human rights. But I believe that history plays a crucial role, and the memories of the people, on forming the new social movements that will try to improve, to a certain extent, of course, the lives of the people, because this is what I believe that a social movement should be the idea of the social movement, improving the lives of the people.
Thank you. Abiodun, I think you...
Yes, thank you very much. So I think historical memory gives movement a sense of continuity, because more time when you look at it, it reminds people what they are going through. It's not just a thing of a sudden effect. It's when you trace it back to history, you would have seen various situations that are synonymous to that. So for instance, when communities remember slavery, when they remember colonial rule, when they remember military repression, apartheid, a long-time economic neglect, and all of that, it shows that today's struggles is just a part of an unfinished story. For instance, the EndSARS that happened in Nigeria 2020, it was a phase that actually gave people an history of how Protestants and the response of the government has been. It's always been there, even right from Southern Africa. We look at the history. There were protests and the massacre. There were massacre and all of that. So it's clearly gives people the memory, and the storytelling is how those memories become alive. When history comes into it, it brings those memories alive. So movement tells stories about fallen heroes, brave women and men, broken promises and stolen futures. So all of this does not just come as an aftermath effect of what happened, but it's purely makes history emotional and more relatable to the people. So we must understand these experiences. So, however, it's never used completely or neutrally. Social movements select the part of history that speak to their present needs. We must understand that. So it highlights certain event symbols, and while ignoring some part, but it's just what it is. It's bring people to a place of understanding the fact that the reason why some things are happening now is because it has connection to what that has happened in the past. So that is what I have to say to that.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I mean, certainly is another early modern example, but I always find it interesting when I hear the feminist slogan, "We're the descendants of the witches you did not burn," which is a reference to an early modern phenomenon. It's not medieval. There was no witch hunt, really, the medieval period. So really that answers that. Although this is not really a global slogan, right? Because the witch hunt is a European phenomenon. But yeah, it does give you this sense of continuity, or at least an invented form of continuity that's actually really catchy.
Thank you so much. Just a quick follow-up question. Do you think we need this continuity? Do you think it makes our ideas and movements stronger if we can connect ourselves to past ideas? How do you think humans feel about this? Oh, I see multiple people want to answer this now. I'm just wondering what you think.
Can you repeat the question? Sorry if I'm interrupting.
So, do you think it's important for people participating in social movements to find some kind of ancestor, ideological ancestor, intellectual ancestor in the past?
Can I answer, or does anyone else want to answer?
To justify, yeah, please go. I can actually listen to this. Can be a kind of final thought for everyone before we turn to questions. So, Michael?
Okay. I believe that every social movement will naturally have some historic ancestor with one way or another. It depends on the movement as well, because some movements we might see, I believe, I'm not certain about this, of course. I don't have all the knowledge required, but I think if we look at the global history, we have many national movements or anti-colonial movements starting in multiple places of the world at the same time periods without necessarily being connected to one another. Or we see science, it's not a social movement, but as an example, we see that things the Europeans, the Greeks, the Romans had, or the Arabs, in terms of mathematics, that maybe some things like that in astronomy were also being discovered in Latin America. But in other occasions, social movements, I believe, that have naturally historic ancestor.
Thank you. Constantine?
Please, can I respond to that?
Yeah, please, yeah.
All right. So I feel it's quite necessary. We need historical memory because if without it, I think there's going to be a disjointed history, and more of the things that happen in the current world will not be properly understood. We will only see reactions from social movements and all of that. We will not be able to understand those things that happened in the past. I think this is why history. This is why history, because there's no way you can disconnect the present from the past. So history memory is quite important, and we can't disjoint them.
Okay.
Yeah, just
That's what I like to view it from a point of the transatlantic slave trade now. We get to see that the abolitionist movement comes from the oppression of the slaves. So it's a memory linked to the liberalization which most of these enslaved people had in their homeland. So then after the slave trade was abolished, then we have slavery being abolished. We see that it's all down to the current Black Lives Matter movement. We can trace it back to its historical memory of slave trade, down to slave abolition. Later, it became more of the Blacks in America searching for equality in the 19th and in the 20th century after slavery has been abolished. So we get to view that through historical memory, that social reforms are not just being, I would say, being coaxed at that moment. It's something that could be traced back to a long-standing movement. It's just that the ideology often changes. And most time, when a social movement starts, or when the aim it achieves might not even reflect on the generation who fought for it, it might be the later generation that tend to enjoy the cause of these social movements.
Thank you, Joseph. And I'd love to hear Constantine and Apeike.
Oh yeah.
as well.
Right. So, I mean, to go back to my original example about modern feminism and the witch hunt, one could sometimes find analytic validity in something that did not really intend to be thus, in the sense that, you can say retrospectively, where, well, the witch hunt is basically, in the 16th century, an expansion of state power and religious orthodoxy, in the same way that modern attempts to restrict access to abortion are another example of the overreach of the state. So you can trace connections like that really have validity if you want them to make them work out like that. So yeah, definitely there is that connection.
Thank you.
Well, I might be the minority voice, or the controversial voice, maybe, to maybe think less of, because when we think of memory, I think that brings us to, and I'm not a scientist, but neurology or something to do with the brain and remembering something. And then if we try to have that between people, because that's what the historical suggests, that I am somehow remembering something that I didn't actually experience, right? So it has to be other people experienced it, but somehow I'm remembering. So I've always found it quite interesting that we use the idea of historical memory, because why is the word history not enough? Because surely the word history already encases in it the idea that it is the experiences of other people that's not you. So that means memory must be doing something in that term, in that phrase, in which case I would say that it's not so much that we need historical memory, more so from maybe a more epistemological point of view, that social movements need a reason for being, and they legitimize those they legitimize those reasons for being with the authority of history. So you can often for social change using religion, for example, so when you have religious movements, it's because God tells me that I have to do it, and I think history as well is another authoritative thing that we as human beings, we give authority to our ancestors, we give authority to our elders, we give authorities really to our past, the iterations of our past selves that have created our culture. And so invention is, I think, a very important part of what I would call historical memory that is not necessarily linked in the truth of what has happened. And I think Constantine kind of mentioned that actually some people might be reaching back to witch trials that didn't even happen, right? So there's also those examples within the Pan-African tradition. And I think also Edwin kind of alluded to this, which is, for a lot of let's take the trajectory that Edwin took us through, leading to the contemporary Black Lives Matter movement. You have a lot of enslaved people imagining an Africa that never existed, for example, right? So at the point at which they wanted to try to gain liberation, they imagined a freedom that they may not necessarily have had in Africa. Maybe they were enslaved in Africa as well. Who knows? Maybe they were just peasants in Africa, but they had a memory of being this greater people in Africa. And likewise, the same even with the EndSARS protests that both Abiodun and Edwin have mentioned. It's an African movement, but drawing inspiration from Afro-Caribbean and African-American memories, that they haven't at all experienced. Nobody in Nigeria today has experienced transatlantic slavery. That's literally the definition. They weren't removed from the continent, but you can tap into or invent memory. So I think that yes, historical memory is important, but it's maybe the designation of or the appropriation of particular reasons for acting, and then sticking history on top of it, or legitimizing it with appeal to history, that is perhaps most important in social change, rather than real historical memory, if we try to understand that term as literally as possible.
Thank you, Apeike. I think that's a very concise and convincing final point to our discussion. I just would like to ask if anyone has any questions to our speakers, to each other. Anything that we discussed today? Yes, Candy.
Hello, for those of you oh, am I unmuted? Yeah. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the coordinator of the Global History Lab, and I'm based in Cambridge. So for me, taking part in these, sort of listening to these discussions is kind of wonderful to see the impact of the kind of work we do in the Global History Lab. Mine is a more general question, and I just wondered, I mean, it's mainly directed at the students, but actually to Apeike and Constantine as well. Did the Global History Lab course change or influence your research interests in any way?
Yes, Michael?
I would say that it encourages more. It encouraged me more to look up more things, but it didn't change necessarily the perspective that global history is important and the interconnectivity of nations is important, because it was something that I was already interested to. But it showed me how much more important it was than I originally thought. So that would be my short answer to the question.
And can I just ask that? So was it the course, or was it the kind of interaction with your fellow students, your teacher, and possibly other institutions that created that influence, that kind of made you realize how important it was?
I would say it was both. The course itself was, as I said in the beginning, it was fulfilling. It had, I believe, all the important aspects that we needed to study in a course like that. Of course, as much as we could, as we mentioned. And the fact that we were in multiple universities, we did these roundtables, it was also something that it was the training in the field. Let's call it that way. It was seeing what it actually feels like to address people from other continents and not just other countries.
Thank you.
That's so interesting to hear. Anyone else?
Yes, it's also worked for me, the interconnectedness, because I was actually working on a research work on international economy and reglobalization. So while taking the global history, I was able to look at it from inception, how the world was interconnected, and not just by migration, but even in the economy. So I was able to pick some historical establishment for my research work. So that was quite great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I just want to add to Ken's question, although I'm a PhD student and I'm not supposed to change my research interest at this point, but teaching global history of the world, and qualitative research methods as well, which is going to be our second semester's subject and focus, definitely broadened my horizons, and I actually started some smaller projects just to engage more with the material that I encountered thanks to GHL. So that's my contribution. But if anyone else has any other thoughts on this, I'd be curious.
Well, it definitely, I mean, I'm not sure if Candy, this is what you were getting at, but from a teaching practice point of view, it's completely changed my opinion actually about how things are taught at the undergraduate level at Cambridge. I think the benefits I've seen of having a textbook is which is something that's I think they might, I don't know if they will let you back in the building in Cambridge if you suggest using a textbook for undergraduate students, but the textbook combined with the case studies, so you are bringing in primary literature, I think works a lot more or a lot better. I hope nobody that matters to my employment Cambridge is going to see this, but I think the combination of textbook and primary sources, I think, works a lot better than the secondary sources that are the grounding the undergraduate history program. Yeah, it just makes a lot more sense to me. So I think it's definitely changed my teaching practice. And I now, very defiantly do actually assign textbook readings to my students, and it just makes for easier conversations because they actually know what's going on, rather than reading just secondary peer-reviewed articles, which can be, I think, sometimes a bit too high level and too specific, too specialized.
Thank you. That's interesting to hear it from that perspective as well.
I think we've come to the end of our conversation. I just want to ask if anyone has any last minute thoughts or reflections on the topics we discussed today. If not, I would like to thank you all for joining me and discussing these very important and fascinating aspects of global history, focusing on social change and movements. I actually put Jeremy Edelman's article in the chat, and I think we will add it to the video description once this is online. Thank you so much for speaking today. I'm also grateful to our audience to join us. Good luck with the rest of your studies, and see you in the next episode. Bye.